According to Money and Health Policy Institute, a charity that researches mental health and debt, half of people with debt problems have mental health problems. And nearly 40% of people with mental health problems say their financial situation worsens their mental health. When we do speak about mental health, what does mental health actually mean? In what form and shape does that take in our lives? How do we address mental health issues, especially when someone is in debt? Understandably, the cost of living crisis further worsens many communities in financial struggle. In this episode, we are speaking about mental health and debt. To navigate this month's podcast with me as your Debt Talk podcast host, Ripon Ray, I have Meghna Uddin, who had the traumatic experience of mental health difficulties with debt collectors, bailiffs knocking on her door for money. She is also or has been a victim of financial abuse. I also have an associate professor of clinical psychology and cognitive behavioral therapy, Dr. Thomas Richardson at the University of Southampton, who also lives with bipolar disorder. Finally, Stephen Coppard, Group Director of Debt Policy and Strategy of Arum, a consultancy business that provides debt solutions to public and private organizations. My guest will also provide you with top tips in the subjects to help listeners near the end of the podcast. Now, if you do want to share your experience on Debt Talk, or you want to listen to a subject of your interest, you can get in touch with me on Twitter, yourdoctordebt.com, or email me, ripon.ray@yourdoctor.debt.com. Now, let me start with Meghna. Thank you, Meghna, for taking the time to share your experience. But before we get into your troubles, what was life like for you before the world was in turmoil?
Thank you, Ripon. Thank you for the invitation to your Debt Talk podcast. Oh, what was life like before my world was in turmoil? I had a very happy childhood growing up. You know, mum, dad, siblings. I was the only girl, so I got a lot of attention from my dad. I was very close to my dad, and growing up in the Midlands, because that's where I was born in the Midlands, and then had a happy childhood. Mum and dad worked hard, very hard, for us to have a good life, and for business purposes, we sold up in the Midlands and moved. Did the big move to London. So I've become a city girl since like the late 70s, early 80s. And I'm glad in ways that mum and dad had moved to London. So yeah, life was very enjoyable. Growing up, you know, usual childhood things, you know, having fun with your siblings, your friends, going to school, primary school, secondary school. And in ways, when I was in secondary school, I sort of had my life mapped out because I wanted to study law, become a criminologist. You know, there was like I had all these aspirations. So yeah, it was a very pleasant, very warming childhood growing up.
So, at what point did you notice that something was not quite right?
Soon as I turned 16, I would say, just after I had done my exams. My life changed very dramatically. In our culture, in our Bangladeshi culture, soon as in those days, and I'm talking about a very long time ago. So 16, 17, then family, marriage was on sort of in the air. I didn't really understand any of it at all. I was seeing people were visiting, and then there were family members, there were cousins, you know, speaking about all of marriage and proposals. So yeah, at that point, still not bothered about any of it because I didn't understand it. I didn't want to know what they were talking about, what family were on about. At that time, just before I had finished my exams, my dad had fell really unwell. and his health was deteriorating. He was a diabetic, he had a stroke, and us as children, as teenagers, me and my siblings, it was very it's hard for us to see, because seeing he was unwell. And I think that brought about how my life dramatically changed. Being the eldest in the family, then I felt responsibilities fell. I think my mum and my dad, especially my dad, thought, well, if anything happens to me, what will happen to my daughter? Maybe marriage proposal, and then she can continue with her studies that way. My life dramatically changed after I got married. Yeah.
So how old were you at the time?
I was 17, just 17 going on to 18. Yeah.
But at what point did you feel psychologically things were going down for you?
Well, when I felt straight on, because I didn't want to be in that position. I rebelled and I didn't rebel. Then I saw my dad wasn't well, and it just finding my voice. So what do I say? How do I express myself? Being a teenager and just thinking about study. I just wanted to go on to college. I had come out with good results. I was happy about those things, but then suddenly found that everything's changed. And I found myself in this situation called marriage, you could say. And the person that I was married to, he was slightly older than me, a few years more older than me. He'd probably lived his life a bit more than I had. And it wasn't a pleasant situation, because I just did not want to be in that situation. I found it very overwhelming. With family, the basics, I didn't know how to cook, clean, those were issues. And then at that early time, my dad did say also that my daughter doesn't know, she only wants to study, so I would like her to continue with her studies. This is what she wants to do. So yes, and then I found myself in situations where I was being, I would say, pretty much controlled what my life was going to be like.
In what way?
In what way? Meaning I wasn't able to continue with my studies as I had planned. So that was stopped. That was put on hold. Then I found myself somehow found myself working, I needed to get into work, and found myself going into family business, or starting up a family business with what now is my ex-partner. And that's when all the financial side of things he was more in control of the finances and how we were doing things, and the businesses that we were, my name was on the businesses, or there were loans brought in my name, we were opening accounts in my name, but I had little control over everything to do with finances, like how it was spent, how the money was spent, how the business finances were dealt with.
So in terms of, let's say, mental health, what way or how would you define that your mental health deteriorated completely? And what were you seeing? What were you thinking? What were your thoughts like?
Well, just before I touch on how my mental health was impacted, I was also a victim of domestic abuse, domestic violence as well at that time, from a very young age, because not wanting to be in that situation, not wanting to conform, I found it very difficult to cope. And hence very early on, I would say from my late teens to my early 20s, I was experiencing that side of mental health impact on myself, where I didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know who to speak to, because I didn't want to stress my family. I didn't want to tell my mom, tell my dad, because you could say there was a lot of abuse going on, but I couldn't even speak to anyone. I didn't have a voice to speak to anyone about what was happening to me. And every time I tried, it was just shut down, because it was family. What would people say? I shouldn't be talking to anyone. I shouldn't be, what will family say? What will community say? Everything looked very good on the outside. because you had the car, you had the house, you had the businesses, you had all the materialistic things, that money could buy, so to say. And this is what everyone saw. And I found personally my mental health was deteriorating slowly, where it came to a point where I began to self-harm. But then again,
in what form does the harm take place?
So my self-harming was in form of harming myself. So I was either cutting myself, or I was doing, just not eating properly, not sleeping properly. And I don't know. I don't know where my head was. It was very confusing as a young adult, I would say. And then becoming older, it just sort of manifested slowly. And then continuing with because I had children. I had to have children. It was sort of forced upon me. And that was another added on impact on my mental, because every time I found myself in that situation, I didn't want to be. I didn't want children. I didn't want to be in the situation I was. Then there were moments in the marriage where I came away. I came to my mum's and my dad's, and to stay with them. I just didn't want to be in with my ex-partner. But then it was more of a patch up, or get family involved. Well, it shouldn't be. You've got children now, or you're going to have to. You're going to have to. Make amends and see how this works out. But I just couldn't express myself. I said I was determined I didn't want to go back to the family home, my family home. And it didn't happen. Then I was financially dependent very much on my ex-partner, because as him having control over. So I couldn't get a place of my own. I didn't know at that time, very long time ago, there was limited where I could seek support even, or advice, even if it was to do with your financially, or what I was experiencing as domestic abuse or domestic violence. So it was very limited. So where I could go for support, and also even speaking to the doctors, or going to the doctors or GP, I wasn't allowed to go on my own anywhere as well. It was pretty much very manipulated what I was allowed to do.
But then how did you come out of it in the end?
So the big step, after many years of an on and off situation, patch up with family members, other family, external family getting involved, both families, my family and my ex-partner's family. It's suddenly, I just woke up one day, I can't live like this anymore. I can't do this anymore. I need to get out of this. And then I made the decision in 2005, I would say, that I can't live like this anymore. It was hard because all my joint accounts I didn't have access to it. He made sure, my ex-partner made sure that I didn't have access to the accounts when I decided to actually, you could say, leave. And I found I had very limited money. And as a result of my name being in the businesses and the properties, I found that now I'm going to come on to where the whole debt scenario came in. I found letters were coming through the post. So where I was living, the address, my own place that I managed to have. And then I started struggling with keeping up with the payments, keeping up with my bills. I was burying my head in the sand, and I couldn't speak to anyone. And when I say I couldn't speak to anyone, I couldn't share that, because I don't know if it was a bit of pride, because I've come away, I'd left my ex-partner. What would people say? Oh, and now I've got to manage on my own, but I've got to think about my children. So it was more, what do I do now? Once you're self-employed, I didn't know anything about the outside world. I didn't know anything about CVs. I didn't know anything about, getting how do I apply for a job? Because when you're on the other side, it doesn't, because I was just managing the businesses, really working in the businesses, you could say, more so. And that's when my whole life just turned upside down, when debt after debt, bailiff letters. It's not that I ignored the letters or the knocking on the door. I wouldn't open the door. I got scared. I got scared of losing my home because this was the only home I had that my children could stay with me. And where do I get the money from? So I sort of reached out to my partner. I said, no, you have to pay for the bills, you have to pay for mortgage, rent, so on and so forth, and maintenance for the children, which he point blank refused to do. He said, if I go back to working in the businesses, I was able to get some money. And I tried that for a while. Not that I didn't, I did do that. I thought, okay, if that saves me from getting into more debt or any letters coming in my name, I'd go and do that. It didn't work out. It was more of an impact on my mental health. I felt suicidal to that point, that what am I going to do? I was breaking down at instances behind closed doors. And again, I couldn't share with my family. I just felt that that was being extra burden on my family.
Did you ever receive any forms of mental health therapy or counseling or support?
So coming to that, then eventually when I started going to my GP, I reached out to my GP. I just broke down. I went to see my GP and I just broke down one day and then started speaking about a lot of the mental health issues that I was having, I wasn't able to cope. So they suggested having some counseling, which was at that time at the surgery, at the GP practice. Initially, I will be honest, I wasn't comfortable with the idea of going to counseling and just speaking about all my problems, because it just wasn't something I did before. And how am I going to start doing that now? And the fear of being judged, because there are a lot of things that I might not have been proud of doing, because obviously I needed to support myself and I needed to support my children and have a roof over my head and food and, carry on so and so forth. So, asking people for money, borrowing money, how do I repay? So yes, I did seek counseling. I did do that for a while. And then I thought, how do I change my situation? How do I come out of the debt? Because everything was piling on. I'm not going to rose it or color it in through rose color glasses, so to say. The debts were piling up because the bills were piling up. The bailiffs were constantly knocking. I was constantly avoiding.
I mean, do you know the difference between a bailiff and a debt collector?
No, I thought it was the same thing. I honestly thought bailiffs and debt collectors and debt collecting agencies, it just looks all the same for someone who wouldn't know the difference. I don't think many people still know the difference, to be honest, what the difference between debt collectors and bailiffs. Yeah.
So how did you manage to rebuild your life?
Well, I'm not going to say it happened overnight, because it didn't. I eventually picked myself up. I eventually got a job in the education sector. And I thought, what, I'm going to utilize, yes, my qualifications might have been from the past when I was doing CSEs and O-levels, so on and so forth. But I thought, what, I've got transferable skills. And it wasn't easy because I didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't know what do I do? What job do I go into? So I found a part-time job. I worked my way up. I managed to, I wouldn't say resolve all my debts, because there were huge amounts of debts. And then I couldn't claim benefit either. So when I did, I had to repay everything back. And I didn't know I couldn't, because property was in my name. So I was in a very catch-22 situation. And then benefit I would get. So and then when I came across all of this, it was just learning and thinking one thing after another. How do I unpick everything? And it just continued, spiraled into different things. Getting part-time work helped a bit, So I was able to, but I had to represent myself in a lot of things like phoning up. I was nervous, but I didn't know what to ask. Letters were coming. There were companies calling, for, like, say, for example, the electricity bill, the services. I just didn't know what to do. And then, as a result of property being my name, I found that I was liable for council tax, but then I managed to sort that out. Then I was liable for other things. So what do? I ended up representing myself in court. This was after, I don't know, some, miracles do happen, and there are people who, in form of angels, you could say. There was this actual bailiff who actually gave me such brilliant advice, and I can't, thank him enough. He actually said, because I told him honestly, yes, because after many visits from them, they said, no, you have to speak to, we have to speak, you have to see what we can do. And he gave me some fantastic advice, saying, no, well, go to the courts, go and speak to the officers there, and they will be able to help explain your situation. And you know what, that really helped. I didn't even know I could go and represent myself in court and speak to court and the judges myself, or speak to the officers myself. So those kind of learning and gaining that kind of experience, and also looking for local services. At that time, there were services there, but I wouldn't say there was as many services as there are now, online or over the phone. Maybe my English was okay, but then even then it was a learning curve for me, going online and looking for, what do I search for, who do, all those things. So it wasn't easy building and rebuilding my life.
And how's the life now?
My life, I would say, I'm in a much better place. I'm in a place that I can help others, and I do help and support others, victims, survivors of multiple problems, financial abuse, economic abuse. And, it's so good that economic abuse is recognized as under the domestic abuse bill, and it exists. Women do suffer, as well as people do suffer with not only debts, but homes are taken away, your lives are taken away as a result of life-changing circumstances. In this case, it was as a result what I was going through in my marriage, and then afterwards all the debts piled up. My life now, I went on back to studying. I'm part of many community-based organizations that help and support people. And I continue to advocate for people, for victims, for survivors, and raise awareness. And also another key thing that I'm passionate about doing, raising awareness and providing information on services that can help people, i.e. mental health, i.e. even if you're in debt, or even if you're a victim of whatever it may be, or if you're exploited, various things for young people and for adults. So yes, I'm in a much better place professionally, and mentally. I had through the years sought out to go into psychological therapies as well, because I was referred as well. And I wasn't sure about it initially, but the therapist I had, she was amazing. She sort of encouraged me. I kept on missing appointments, but she encouraged me. She sort of like grounded some rules, and I went on to having CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. It was for something else, but it triggered, and from that I found there were so many underlying issues that I had to unpick, and for myself to be mentally in a better place now. So yes.
Meghna, I'm very privileged to actually hear your experience for sure. Let me get Thomas Richardson into the conversation. Thomas, based on what you've heard from Meghna, what is your initial thought?
Well, I mean, first of all, Meghna, thank you so much for being sort of brave enough to come and talk about your experiences. It's really important to know, for other people to know that they're not alone. One of my research projects showed that actually two of the things that can turn financial difficulties such as debt into depression and anxiety is hopelessness and B, shame. And I think what you've just done there is giving people a bit of hope that things can improve even when they feel like they're at their worst. It's not quick, as you said, but things can improve. And B, I think you've just really helped just try and de-shame it all, because why should people be ashamed about their financial situation in the current cost of living and, in the situation you were in with the kind of financial control and abuse as well. So thank you. I really appreciate it. And I'm glad you're, I'm glad that you've got some help now in finances and therapy wise. That's really nice to hear. I think just a lot of the things you talked about, Meghna, definitely relate to my experiences working sort of as a clinician and also as a researcher on those links between debt and mental health. In terms of the kind of just being constantly on edge with bailiffs, and there is a real risk that if there's aggressive debt collection tactics, can essentially re-traumatize people. People who have been through difficulties and had their own traumas, and then they have people kind of knocking at the door again. It can make people feel very, very on edge, definitely. And go on.
So, Thomas, you yourself live with bipolar disorder. How does that impact you or has impacted you in the past?
Yeah, well, bipolar disorder is something one of the special interests of mine as a researcher as well. And I've done quite a lot about the link between sort of money and mental health and bipolar disorder. It's something I live with, and it's something where I'm stable for a lot of the time. I've been stable for a while now, which is good, but I do have episodes. And for me, it's, again, using the same kind of CBT skills, which Meghna was talking about, looking at my work-life balance and sleep and exercise, and trying to be a bit kinder to myself sometimes and make sure I give myself a break and watch my kind of overworking perfectionist kind of tendencies, I think. Yeah, so it's something I live with.
You mentioned also, Meghna mentioned about CBT.
Yeah.
Can you tell us the structure of CBT therapy?
Yeah. So CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy. It's about kind of the link between your thinking patterns, your emotions, your behaviors. And I always think of it like you're trying to understand the vicious cycles we can all get into and how we can break out of them. That's really what I like to think CBT is in a nutshell. So one of the things Meghna was talking about there, about the burying your head in the sand, that's a real theme that comes from my research about money problems and debt, is it becomes a vicious cycle because you're in debt and then you avoid it, and it makes your anxiety worse, but it also it makes the finances worse long term. So a lot of the ways we try to cope help short term, but they make things worse in the long run, and that's no different with finances. So CBT is trying to help people be more kind of balanced in their thinking. It's not about positive thinking, but being aware of maybe very self-critical tendencies or catastrophizing, assuming the worst, and trying to find new ways to cope with emotions, and kind of maybe facing your fears as well. And that might be opening the first bill, like Meghna said, it's starting small and building your way up. And one of the things I'm interested in is trying to tweak CBT to fit in with, to make sure that CBT is as effective it can be, and do we need to tweak and adapt it slightly for people who are in real financial hardship? So what was called IAPT, it's now being rebranded as NHS Talking Therapy, which is like the main provider of CBT for depression and anxiety in England, at least. We know that people from more deprived parts of England, don't tend to do as well from therapy. They tend to, finish therapy a bit more depressed and anxious. They don't get quite as much out of it, and they maybe take a bit more time to improve. So I'm interested in thinking about how we can improve outcomes. And there's a program I wrote called Space for Money Worries, which is being used in a lot of these NHS therapy services now, which is an online self-help package, but with some support by a professional, which is specifically designed to tackle those links between kind of debt and mental health. So helping people be a bit more balanced about their thinking, a bit kinder to themselves about their money, and helping them sort of, try and face their finances and get a little bit more back on top of things, rather than as is often the case, just kind of avoiding and burying your head in the sand, because it just feels too overwhelming when you're depressed or when you're anxious.
I mean, I know we mentioned briefly around CBT, but is this the only strategy for dealing with mental health, or is there any other?
I mean, for mental health broadly, no, it's not the only therapy. I guess it's kind of the one of the most commonly used one, and there's very strong evidence for it, especially for things like depression, anxiety. But no, there's lots of other therapies kind of offered in the NHS. It really depends on the problem. So there's other therapies like acceptance and commitment therapy, which is a kind of a spin-off, as it were, of CBT, which is more about acceptance, and that can be quite useful for people in financial hardship, and for therapies where people might be very emotionally up and down. There's a therapy called DBT. For trauma therapies, there's different options, such as something called EMDR. So no, it's not the only option. It's the one that's probably most commonly used and has the strongest evidence base. But yeah, there's lots of other things out there, and family therapy as well, for example, can be really helpful, and the counselling, which Meghna talked about. So there's lots of options out there. It's not the only one, but it's probably the most commonly used.
So is there any alternative solutions apart from therapy, such as medicine?
There are lots of medication options. I don't prescribe medicine because I'm a psychologist, so I can't really talk to that. But yeah, I think all the best evidence is often that it's a 2 or 3 pronged approach. So if someone is experiencing depression, medication and therapy is often maybe a way forwards. There's also lots of kind of lifestyle, etc. factors that we can do. But I think what I'm interested in really is that, and I think what Meghna was talking about speaks to that quite strongly, that there is just, you were saying about how you didn't know where to go, which is completely understandable. And I think the problem people find themselves in is that they're not sure which service to go in, right? If I'm really depressed and I'm in loads of debt, who do I talk to about that? Do I go to the GP? Do I go to someone to speak about my debt? Now, the way I view it as a psychologist is, you're more than 3 times as likely to have a mental health problem if you're in debt. Or looking at it the other way, you're more than 3 times as likely to be in debt if you have a mental health problem. It works both ways. So from my perspective, for people who are in debt and struggling with mental health, I think it is about trying to get us work on both kind of at the same time. If you're getting therapy, but you're still, if you're getting therapy, but you're experiencing, like Meghna did, having up to eyeballs in debt and having bailiffs knocking on the door, you're still going to be experiencing a lot of anxiety from that. So I think the more we try to do to integrate them and tackle both at the same time, the better. And that's some of the work I'm trying to do. I think it's difficult because services are set up separately, aren't they? Kind of mental health service here and finances there. Never the twain shall meet. But I think the more we can link those services up, the better. There's been some research that kind of embedding debt advice within mental health services shows quite a lot of promise, really. And it's hard work to reach out from your help when depressed. So if we just signpost people to, here's a flyer, ring this person for debt advice, they may not do it. So I think the more joined up working we can do, and the smoother the kind of links and transitions between like your mental health and your financial support, the better. The way I view it, they're so overlapping as to be the same problem. So we need to work on them both at the same time. Thank
you, Thomas. Let me get Stephen Coppard, Group Director of Debt Policy and Strategy of Aram. Steve, I know you've worked in a variety of industry within the context of debt, and also what's your kind of, first impression on what Meghna and Thomas have said so far?
Thanks, Ripon. So look, a couple of things that Meghna said really hit home with me. So first, I think about everything looking rosy on the outside, which I think is quite often the case. People don't realise what other people are going through until the cracks start to show. And then also the impact of economic abuse, which is a feature in most domestic abuse cases. And of course, today, you know, the work that charities like Surviving Economic Abuse and others have done in getting the economic abuse evidence form in place, and even the government now has launched an economic abuse toolkit for debt teams. So we're starting to shine a light on that a lot more. And I was just really heartened to hear that eventually, it would have been nice had it been up front, but eventually the support that Meghna got, and actually that coming from an enforcement agent, from a bailiff as well, who was able to signpost her in the right direction. And then Thomas mentions, you know, that people in deprived areas often finish therapy a bit more anxious and depressed than when they started. That really struck me, because the Financial Conduct Authority's Financial Lives Survey found that people living with a mental health condition who also have a debt are 50% less likely to recover than people living with the same condition who don't have a debt. The links between debt and mental health are so inextricably linked. You know, you can't get away from that. So it all resonates really loud and clear with me. And having had personal experience, first of debt-related mental health, and then latterly mental health-related debt problems, I could just say this is all too common, and I don't think that we speak about it enough. So it's fantastic. I think that we're helping to shine a light on this today. And look, the industry as a whole is really good at this, but we have some way to go as a nation before money troubles are spoken about. I'll say it as freely as mental health concerns. You know, there was a YouGov poll a couple of years ago that found 44% of people are comfortable talking about their mental health, while only 20% of people are comfortable talking about debt. So just think about that for a minute. People are twice as likely to tell you they have a mental health problem than they are to tell you that they have money troubles. And you know, the government's Money and Pension Service, supported by the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute, who you mentioned earlier, they've just issued an evidence-based best practice guide, which covers everything from training staff to accessible product and service design and clear communications. So I think the fact that we continue to invest time and effort into this area shows that there is more to be done, but it's a recognised topic now.
And Steve, from my experience of debt advice, there are several debt options available to individuals struggling. There is also a regulatory breathing space as a short-term measure. And what was the underlying purpose of breathing space?
So just to give a bit of context, I think, Ripon, then breathing space was a Conservative manifesto commitment from 2017 under Theresa May's government. And at the time, there was a programme of activity to support what the government was calling JAMS, the people who were just about managing. And the overarching intention was to give people time to seek advice and then assistance to apply for a sustainable solution to their debt. And it recognised that for some people, the cost of living can become too great. And look, this was 2017, right? So we're talking pre-COVID, we're talking pre-Ukraine, we're talking pre-cost of living crisis as we know it now. So this problem's only got worse since 2017. But it recognised even then that the cost of living can become too great and that problem debt could be hard to escape, which led to higher levels of family breakdown, worklessness, stress and mental health issues. And the breathing space was intended to provide the right safeguards to prevent abuse so that someone in serious problem debt could have legal protection from the further interest charges and enforcement action for a period. It was initially defined as up to 6 weeks, but we know that ended up being 60 days. But in the case of a mental health crisis breathing space, it's practically indefinite. And then there was the statutory debt repayment plan that was also part of that pledge. That was intended to help people pay back their debts in a manageable way. But as we know, the government's decided to pause the introduction of the statutory debt repayment plan until the outcome of the personal insolvency review is known.
How does it work though in practice? How does breathing space, both mental health and standard breathing space, actually work in practice? How do you get it?
So it's through the application of a debt advice agency. So look, it's really important that people seek free debt advice, and I will talk about this a little bit later as well. But I completely understand that it can feel like a mountain to climb to start addressing debt, and actually for some people the problems they have in their life are bigger than the debt. So the debt takes second place to other things, even though it's, and I think Thomas mentioned, sometimes short-term coping mechanisms aren't necessarily the best thing for us in the long run, but you deal with what you can deal with today. The beauty about getting free debt advice is it allows you to have one conversation once, not one conversation multiple times with different organisations who may or may not accept what you're saying and actually work to different rules. So I think we know that poor mental health is not an on-off switch. It's a nuanced gradient, a sliding scale, and it's not binary either. It doesn't travel in a single direction. You could be on a long-term descent but still have good and bad days along that journey. So in practical terms, there is a mental health crisis breathing space, which is only available to somebody who's actually receiving mental health crisis treatment. And that breathing space lasts as long as the treatment does, plus a further 30 days. And look, a mental health crisis is fairly specific in definition. So it's when somebody feels like they're at breaking point and need urgent help. So it could be extreme anxiety, panic attacks, flashbacks, or feeling suicidal or self-harming, or having an episode of hypomania or mania, feeling very high, or psychosis. Hearing voices or feeling extremely paranoid, and look, this could be as a result of bereavement, addiction, money problems, relationship breakdown, workplace stress, exam stress, housing problems. It could just be part of an ongoing mental health diagnosis, or people might not even know why they feel that way. And I think then, just by contrast, the more, and I don't want to play this down, but more low key mental health issues are dealt with differently. So they're dealt with it as any other vulnerability would be, and that's your standard 60-day breathing space.
Meghna initially mentioned about bailiffs and debt collectors. Now, Steve, you've been around in the industry for a very long time. What is the difference between the two?
So I was really interested to hear that, because I had a very similar conversation with my wife just the other night about this. I'm a debt nerd. She isn't. She works for the NHS. So Meghna's experience is a common point that I make to the industry quite often. The terms we use day in, day out are not understood by most people. And it doesn't help, when mainstream media talk about things like aggressive debt collectors, and what they actually mean is an agent who's enforcing a court order following 20 to 40 communication attempts. So let's define it. A debt collection agency can only send you, or debt collector can only send you letters, messages, and call you. And they do this at the instruction of a client who believes you owe them money. They'll never visit your home or take control of your goods. So that's a debt collector. It's all about communication and encouragement to pay. An enforcement agent is there to execute a court order or warrant. And the most common kind, it would be a civil enforcement. So there are others, but let's not get into that here and now. It's civil enforcement is the most common kind, but there is a court order sitting behind it. Now, the legislation that overarches this, that gives it its force, is actually called the Taking Control of Goods Act. The reason this is because by the time that somebody goes to court, it is assumed that you can no longer pay, and so they're coming to look for assets to sell to satisfy the debt. In practice, seizing assets is expensive for the person, so the fees will rack up on top of the debt, and the person in debt has to pay them, which actually detracts from them being able to repay the principal debt and causes an awful lot more stress and worry. And then when you take goods away, you don't get anywhere near the market value for them at auction. And there are so many things that the enforcement agents can't take, Ripon. They can't take things that you need to live. So you have to have a chair, you have to have a bed, you have to have curtains, you have to have a refrigerator, you have to have knives and forks and plates. We're talking about, should you be lucky enough to 50-inch TV on the wall. That's the sort of thing that's going to go. And what do you pay for a second-hand TV? So yes, they are there to execute the court order. They're not necessarily debt collectors. They are there to go and take control of goods, but they will try and get you to resolve the issue without a visit taking place. The best agencies will always try and resolve cases at what's called the compliance stage. So that the compliance stage is effectively, it acts just like a debt collection agency, except they can obviously escalate to a visit afterwards. Now, if they can't get hold of you or come to any arrangement, then the enforcement agent will visit your property and you know, it will give you a final chance to pay. And if you can't, and there's no reason to prevent the visit from going ahead, then the agent will assess the value of your eligible goods and they may actually take them away. I think the critical thing to remember with civil enforcement is that they can't break into your house. You know, that's so where Meghna said earlier that she didn't open the door, you know, they can't force that issue. But it's important for people to understand the end to end, because if you're unable to resolve it at that point, then it may well go to litigation, which can end up in bankruptcy, which has, you know, impacts on people's credit scores for another 6 years. It's not saying that it's not the right answer for some people, but as a rule, it would be much better if it can be resolved at the earliest stage in the process.
Thank you, Stephen. For those who are listening to Debt Talk podcast and want to share your experience or want to listen to a specific debt-related subject, you can get in touch with me on Twitter, Your Dr. Debt, or you can email me, ripon.ray@yourdrdebt.com. Let me speak to my panelists now about them providing Debt Talk listeners with top tips on dealing with mental health and debt during the cost of living crisis. So let me start with Meghna.
I just want to echo on what Thomas and Steve have both said about seeking advice, not feeling hopeless, and dealing with it very early on, because I think most of the time, because we're not aware how early we can deal with it, or can we deal with it, and what are the processes are to actually reaching out to someone or calling someone up. And the other thing is, if you're not sure, please go speak to someone, because I think most of the time we don't want to share, especially when we're facing financial difficulties, financial hardships. We don't want to share that we're struggling. We don't want to share that we can't pay our bills, our rent, our mortgage, that we can't afford food. You know, it's reality. And more so, we've seen it with cost of living rising, and the amount of support that really truly that companies, organizations, banks and other services have shown, along with mental health. So please speak to those services. Don't keep those letters. Don't ignore the phone calls, because I would just say you just need to speak, share what's going on, share your circumstance, what you can afford, if you can afford, what you can't afford, if you're on benefits. And there's a lot of also in boroughs that you live in, or the areas of your residence, you can also reach out to the local council, because there's support that they can also provide with some relief, as well as reach out to charity organizations that help with debt resolving debts. So yeah, definitely speak out, share with someone close to you that can advise you in the right way. If there's no one there that you can speak or share that with, if it's not a family member or a close friend, reach out to your GP, because now most GP services have this social prescribing and service that can sort of signpost or refer you to the right places. And speak to the, as Stephen mentioned, debt collectors, speak to the bailiffs, not to ignore correspondence, not to ignore the phone calls. And I know that's what I was doing in the past, because I just didn't want to acknowledge what was going on. But slowly I realized that this is when I share my own experience, or when I'm even supporting someone or advising them, I would advise, let's sit down, let's go through sometimes when we sort of put it down on paper, write it out, what is actually, what's going on, what do our debts look like? It might not be that, it might be a huge amount, but it just feels like at the time it's a lot to deal with. And slowly just going through, having a plan of who to pay first, how to go about paying, really does make a difference. But slowly, not to feel hopeless, not to lose hope. There is support out there. I know sometimes there are maybe some advisors or some customer service support is not that great, but there are people that do help and do support. We just need to not stop and not just totally just shut off from what's going on in our lives to see that.
Lovely, Meghna. Thank you. And now to Thomas.
Yeah, so like Meghna's saying, ask for help. I think the key thing here, like I said, is trying to ask for help about both finances and mental health at the same time. And you can actually find your own NHS talking therapy. If you just Google it on the NHS website, you can self-refer. You don't necessarily need to go through your GP for kind of therapy for depression and anxiety. Don't be ashamed. You're not alone. There's lots of people, unfortunately, who are in the same situation. So just, I think, be kind to yourself about this and try and talk about it. Yeah, Meghna was saying about, trying to talk to creditors, yes, but I think actually being quite open that you do have mental health problems, because they should treat you differently as a vulnerable customer. And then finally, I think just, facing your fears, like I said, one step at a time. It's very completely understandable to avoid, but the bills will just pile up. Your mental health's going to get worse. So trying to kind of open one bill, face your fears gradually, slowly, one step at a time. It's just going to make you feel a little bit more confident, a little bit more hopeful that you will eventually be able to dig yourself out of this situation.
Lovely. And finally, Steve.
Thanks, Ripon. So I'm glad I had 4 written down, because my first 3 have gone already. So look, I had you have to face it at some point. I had make a plan, and I also had the shame and guilt point and not blaming yourself. 1 in 8 people at the moment in the UK are in problem debt. And problem debt is where you're behind. We define it as where you're behind with 1 or more household bills. So you certainly aren't alone. So my tip will be something around a benefit you can actually get. The side benefit of going for debt advice is the secondary services that they can put you in touch with. So one is income maximizers, who can look at benefits and discretionary housing payments. And I've actually seen cases where the benefit or the income that people were entitled to receive has wiped out their debt. So it's incredibly important. Another is a company called Zero Deposit. So if people are in rented accommodation, maybe stuck in what we call the lifetime deposit trap, where you've got a deposit wrapped up in a property and you can't afford to save for another one, you can actually liquidate that and bring it down from 6 weeks rent to around 1 week's rent, and they will indemnify the landlord for you. And you can do that whether you're looking for a new property or whether it's for your existing property. There are services out there like Reach Out from a company called Sigma, who will put you in touch with bereavement counsellors, with cancer charities, with addiction, gambling, alcohol, whatever you can imagine situation you're in, they can put you in touch with specialist support. And one more that I'll mention is there's a company called Superfy Finance. They do a little app where if you've got loads of credit cards and loans and buy now, pay laters and that sort of thing, and you're about to tip over the edge, but you're not quite there, you're not really in the debt space yet, but you're coming up to it. What Superfy does, you can put all of your debts into the app, and it will tell you how much to pay off each one to get you out of debt the fastest. So there are tools out there, there are services out there. There is so much help available to people, but we can't give you that help unless you're talking to us.
Lovely. It's good to talk. I want to thank my panel members for giving their time to share their experience and knowledge on Debt Talk podcast. My next episode will be on LGBT plus and money trouble on Debt Talk podcast during cost of living crisis. Thank you for listening to Debt Talk from your host, Ripon Ray.